Good evening, friends. And this is the new episode of Through Literary Lens. Vinod ji, namaskar.
Namaskar. How are you, Rajesh ji?
Yeah, we are fine. I'm fine. How are our listeners? They should tell us in their comments and all. And today, Vinod ji,
Yes.
there is neither story nor a poem nor a novel.
Then
Then there is something different.
something different.
Yeah.
In the last episodes, we were discussing about William Shakespeare, but now you are surprising me by saying that there is something different.
Yeah, there is something different. Some people do not regard this as the part of literature, but it is a part of literature. And the person today we will be talking about it is none else than the poet critic, Mr. T S Eliot.
T S Eliot.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is well-known poet, critic, and his contribution to the literature is so great that the entire modern age is known after his name.
Yeah.
It is the age of Eliot.
But poet as well as the critic. What does a critic do, Vinodji? Does he simply criticize?
No, it is not to be taken at the face value. The meaning of this word, criticism, is scholarly review, critical review of a literary work, where the critic brings out not only the merits and demerits, but he also unfolds the various layers of the literary piece so that the piece becomes understandable for the readers. Moreover, he takes us through the literary work so that we can come to understand the complexities, the intricacies, and the hidden meanings, layers of meanings which are always there in any masterpiece of literature.
So we can say that critic simply doesn't criticize, but he or she lays bare the various aspects of the work of literature, intrinsic as well as the extrinsic aspects. By this I mean that the meanings and the layers, as you say, which are there in the piece of literature, but which may or may not be apparent to a reader.
Exactly. What happens, Rajesh ji? Any
Yeah.
good piece of literature is like a complex riddle, which may not be properly, correctly interpreted by an ordinary reader. Therefore, it requires a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, a lot of insight to understand that riddle. So, the critic basically explains the various aspects of the riddle, which is a masterpiece of literature.
They make explicit what is implicit, we can say.
Yes.
Isn't
Yes.
it?
They make simple what is complex.
What is complex,
They communicate what is unsaid by the writer or the poet.
and they make it conspicuous what may remain hidden.
Exactly. T S Eliot got Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948.
48, yeah.
And
many
today-
of his poems.
Yeah, many
are
of his
there.
poems. The Westland is masterpiece, which is world famous. It is called as the epic of the 20th century. It was written after the World War First and came to be published first in 1922, and it took the world by its what is newness, by
Yeah.
its strangeness, the kind of poetry that T S Eliot writes in the Westland is something that the readers and the scholars were not familiar with earlier.
But Vinodji,
Yeah.
today
Yeah.
we will not discuss is the Westland.
Oh, I was under the impression that we are going to touch the Westland, which is the masterpiece of T S Eliot.
No, but before that, I think we
Yeah.
should discuss his very famous work, critical work.
Oh, yeah.
It is called The Tradition and
individual
Individual
talent.
This will give us a glimpse of who Eliot was, how he thought about the literature, and then it will be perhaps easy to understand the Westland in the next episode.
I must share with the listeners that this Tradition and Individual Talent, this essay basically, which was published in 1919, right,
yeah.
is considered to be the manifesto of the creed of criticism of T S Eliot. In other words, the most important ideas of the criticism of T S Eliot are well expressed in this essay.
Even though later on he called it as his most juvenile essay, but still it is the fact that it laid the foundation of what is called new criticism.
No, definitely this essay is full of lot of ideas, right? And those who really want to understand literature, especially that of poetry, they need to understand T S Eliot's ideas.
It will be useful for any kind of poetry, whatever you read. If you are familiar with Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, you will get a perspective on the poetry which you are reading, or any literature which you are reading.
Before we proceed to look at the main ideas of this essay,
Yeah.
it is really imperative that we must clarify the two terms, what Eliot means by tradition and what he means by individual talent.
By tradition, he simply doesn't mean the sticking to the age-old rituals.
It
It's
is
a
not.
common,
It
yeah.
is not as we understand tradition.
Yeah.
Generally, we understand tradition following the past, or copying the past, or imitating the earlier generation, or imitating something else. When we say that some particular poet is a traditional, what do we mean generally? We mean that he imitates some other poet or the writer. So it is the term of censor, he says, in literature,
Yeah.
that one should not be traditional in that ordinary sense of the tradition. But once we understand the meaning of tradition from Eliot's point of view,
Yeah.
then it becomes desirable to follow tradition in literature. So
Generally, whenever we read a poem, we say, "Oh, there is nothing new in it."
Exactly.
Right? We only admire something new. Oh, this is something new.
that is the individual talent.
That is the individual talent.
Something
Yeah.
new.
But
Eliot says tradition is what?
Yeah.
Tradition is critical understanding of the past.
Is the historical sense, historicity, we can call it. One should know, particularly, interestingly, he says, Vinodji,
Yes.
anybody who writes poetry after the age of 25
Yes.
should be familiar with the entire history of Europe, he says, but we can substitute it with any continent or even the human history itself, particularly the literary history.
Right. He says tradition is not inherited,
Yeah.
but tradition has to be laboriously cultivated, acquired by labor. That means, he says, one has to undertake the labor of critically understanding the past. That is, he must read and understand the literature of the past and try to understand what is good and what is bad, what is desirable, what is not desirable. So it is developing a critical insight into the literary tradition.
As I am reminded of Arnold, who says one should know the best that has been
Thought and written.
written.
Now, of course, Eliot is aware that this is really a very difficult task. It is not an easy task, right? But he says that once you undertake this labor of cultivating tradition, only then the great work can be written. And good poet is always aware of the past. He makes a very famous sentence that the present is influenced by the past,
Yeah.
and the past is influenced by the present.
That's very interesting, Vinodji. This has to be understood properly.
Now, the first part of the sentence is very easy to
Very
understand.
easy. Everybody agrees with it.
If you are aware of Shakespeare, for example, and then if you go and write a drama, you are aware of the great Shakespearean tradition of drama. Therefore, there is every likelihood that your creation of drama is going to be influenced by the past.
Like in India, suppose any poem, anything is written, and one is naturally aware of Mahabharata,
Yes.
one is aware of Ramayana, one is aware of Kalidasa. Not only aware, they exert their influence somehow or the other.
And to supplement this statement, T S Eliot says all the dead and immortal poets continue to live in the present works.
Yeah.
That is very important.
Yeah.
That if you write something today in 2022, that means in your work, directly or indirectly, all the important poets and the writers of the past, they continue to exert influence on your writing. That is how the immortal and dead poets continue to live.
They reverberate across the ages, I should say.
Through illusions, through references, through quotations, and sometimes in a very subtle form, right? In the form of ideas, in the form of stylistics, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, sometimes directly also.
Exactly, directly as well.
One takes the stories from them, one takes even the fictional characters from them, but more so indirectly.
More so indirectly. And the second part of the statement, the present influences the past.
Yeah.
Now, this is to be understood. He says, when some original or really new work arises on the horizon of the literature, the entire monument of the literature gets adjusted a little. To tell you, in a simple word, if something great is written today, under the light of that new literary work, we are compelled to interpret, examine, and critically understand the earlier works once again.
Yeah, once again.
The very good example is that when Shakespeare had written Hamlet,
Yeah.
he, in all the probability, was not aware of the fact that there is a kind of Oedipus complex in Hamlet.
Yeah.
When Freud came and he propounded his psychoanalysis and Oedipus complex, so we or all the critics went back to Hamlet and understood Hamlet from the point of view of Oedipus complex. So the new theory helps us to understand the past literary works as well.
Like I am reminded in Indian literature of an example. There is a Khandakavya called Shambhuk. I forget the poet, but it is written recently, last century it was written, 50 years ago.
Yes.
If you read Shambhuk, Shambhuk was a Kshudra character, untouchable, who
Yes.
was assassinated or killed by Rama because he was doing tapasya.
Exactly.
Now, if you read Shambhuk and then again revisit Ramayana, your perspective would change.
Definitely, you will try to understand that even the great man, so-called great man, Lord Rama, he also suffered from the contemporary, contemporary conditioning against so-called depressed classes.
Or there is a story that describes the last moments of Duryodhan.
Yes.
And while dying, he says, only regret of my life is that my father was blind. Had he not been blind,
Yes.
just midway he dies. If you read that story and again read Mahabharata is reconfigured.
Exactly. So that is how Eliot says that present invariably influences the past.
Like to give a non-literary example, social example, Vinodji.
Yes.
When a girl marries and goes to her in-laws, her in-laws family is complete. Otherwise also it was complete.
Before the marriage, before the daughter-in-law comes to the family is complete. But the relationship between son and father, son and mother and
already
father, already there.
But when the wife goes to her husband's place, to her in-laws,
Entire dynamics of the relationship has to be readjusted a little.
Reconfigured a little.
Exactly. So that is the significance of really newer. Here, T S Eliot emphasizes it is not that every work when it is written, it will alter the existing monument, he says, existing monument of the literature. But when something really great work arises on the scene, for now it's very difficult to pass a judgment what is great and what is not. And he says, time is the, he says that greatness arises out of time. At the same, if something is contemporary, it is very difficult to say whether that work is a great or not. In course of time, gradually the greatness of the work evolves. And one more thing he says, no poet, no writer is original, entirely original ever. That is impossibility.
Definitely, because anything entirely new you cannot say. All has been said earlier. So the way in which you say can only differ, can only be a little new, a different way of saying the things. As you say, ideas are not copyrighted. The way in which they are expressed is copyrighted.
Exactly. And one more idea of T S Eliot.
Before going further, Vinodji, let me clarify.
Yes.
That by tradition, it does not mean the weight of tradition.
Yes.
It's not something heavy to be born, but one should be aware. One should be sensitive. One should cultivate the tradition. One cannot be uprooted and then claim to be a literator, an author, and a writer. Isn't it?
Yes, it is a continuous whole.
Yeah.
He says right from the times of Homer till this day, the entire body of European literature is one unbroken tradition. Similarly, when we talk of, say, we are writing in Hindi, so right from Ramayana and Mahabharata till the contemporary poets, it's one single unified tradition of Hindi literature. And this is true in case of all the literatures. If we take all the literatures as single unit, then we must be aware of all the great literatures of the world.
I think, Vinodji, when literature courses are taught, there should be something called universal literature. Great works of all the civilizations should be taught.
Exactly. Because if you look at the great pieces of literature, they reflect universal passions, universal feelings, universal concerns, and the human nature which is same across the time, across the places.
Of course, they operate in their own cultural space. It's not denying the fact. But still, one should have a perspective of all the major cultures also.
Absolutely. And another important idea of T S Eliot that needs to be discussed here is regarding the creation of poetry.
What is the individual talent? How is the poetry created? That's very interesting perspective.
And that is exactly opposite to what William Wordsworth had said in his preface to lyrical ballads way back in
What's what I say? It's a very,
1798.
very commonsensical, Vinodji. If you ask any person going on the street, how is the poetry created, he or she definitely will emotions recollected in tranquility.
It is the expression of emotion. Anybody who has not even read literature, he will tell you that poetry is what? Poetry is the expression of emotion. It's the expression of love, expression of sorrow, expression of happiness. So what's what that said that it is
emotions recollected in
spontaneous overflow of emotions recollected in tranquility. But T S Eliot takes the other end of this continuum, right? He says poetry is not it's not the powerful or spontaneous overflow of the feelings. Neither it can be recollected in tranquility. He says that poetry is the process of depersonalization. It is not the expression of personality, but it is an escape from personality.
Escape from emotion also.
Emotion also. He makes a very, very important sentence. The man who suffers and the man who creates, they are two different things. So it happens that the life of the poet may be very ordinary, but the poem that he writes can be of extraordinary emotional significance, imaginative significance.
What happens is that the mind of the poet is like a receptacle.
It's like a jar.
It receives the emotions, feelings, thoughts, imaginations, and combines them in unique ways.
So the poet or poet's personality is nothing but it is a catalyst that speeds up the process of poetic creation. It is as simple as that. For example, if you are aware of the process of making tea, right? Yeah. You put sugar, you put some tea powder, you milk and the water, and you put the jar on the fire. Now, after some time, heat is generated in the pot and the tea is ready. Now, when you drink the tea, jar remains as it is. Yeah. But without the contribution of jar,
you can't make it.
You can't make it. So jar plays the role of a catalyst. So the poet or poet's personality rather is nothing but it is a catalyst in the entire process of creativity or the creation of the poetry, especially as T S Eliot says. But it is applicable to all the type of creativity.
Yes.
It's all the type of creativity. The poet's personality is not created. It is not expressed in the creativity, but it is a catalyst. It is an element that helps the entire process.
So this is totally opposite of the, as you said, Wordsworth and the romantic conception and common sense conception of poetry.
Yes.
I'm not expressing myself directly in the poetry. I'm just a means, so to say.
Right.
Like a scientist conducts an experiment, so does a poet, but the outcome of the poet's experiment is a poem.
Yes. It is, in other words, it is a journey from personal to universal.
Personal, yeah.
So something that is personal, it has to be metamorphosed so that when it is finally expressed, it acquires the status of universality. If something is not universal in literature, that is short of good literature, basically.
And then this resulted in concentration on the poem rather than the poet. The criticism got concentrated on the poem, its intrinsic, extrinsic explication of the poem, rather than concentrating on the poet and his or her personality in the poem. So this gave rise to sort of new criticism, what is called new criticism.
Yes, new criticism. New criticism is entirely focused on the literary work. It does not pay attention to the poet or the writer. And then to the end of the modernism and the postmodernism when it comes, at some other time, Rajesh, will be discussing very important pronouncements which come from Roland Barthes or Jacques Derrida. They are all post-modernist. So sometimes we'll also take up a discussion on that. But today it is really very interesting to understand.
I mean, at least this much we have reached from T S Eliot's opinions we have discussed. That poem then assumes an independent character.
Yes.
Apart from the author. जैसे कहते हैं शेर जो है वो शायर से कहीं आगे चला जाता है.
बिल्कुल.
A couplet goes much beyond the creator.
Exactly. So this contribution of T S Eliot that he has written in this essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, is very, very important, and it is prescribed almost in all the PG programs of literature, especially the literary criticism. And understanding T S Eliot is really helpful to all the writers and the poets who intend to create something really good. So tell us how you like this episode, especially write your comments in the chat box, and we'll be back with some other interesting discussion. Till this time, read T S Eliot.
Yeah, namaskar.